Hi there, my name's Ed, and I'll be honest with you, I've been feeling pretty burnt out recently, to the point where the only thing I feel up to doing in my spare time is listening to this schlocky podcast or playing Cities Skylines. Yeah, I love building these plucky urban environments, trying to turn them into real places. But are these cities actually places? What exactly is a place, and what does it tell us about politics? Welcome to this video essay on city builders, shitty builders, and the politics of place.
Onward, of course you must have lots of demands!
Cities Skylines is a city building game released in 2015, developed by Colossal Order and published by Paradox Interactive. City building games are a subgenre of simulation games, where the player in effect acts as a town planner, being responsible for the management of a city that, more often than not, they built from scratch, and Cities Skylines is no different. Skylines was standing on the shoulders of simulation giants. SimCity, the largest city simulator franchise for decades, provided the blueprint for the genre that almost all subsequent city simulators strove to simulate. But none of them could topple SimCity's crown. Its sequels, SimCity 2000, 3000, and 4000, 4, were the hallmarks of the genre for the longest time. They followed the same addictive gameplay loop: build streets, zone space, provide services, grow demand, build more streets, zone more space, provide more services, grow more demand, build more streets, zone more space, grow more demand, grow more demand, grow more demand! You see, the loop had to be broken eventually. SimCity 2013 was released to universal disgust. So Cities Skylines took its chances, and upon release, it slew the king and grabbed the crown. Or should that be slew the city mayor and grabbed the weird provincial cloak? And now it is basically the king. People are still playing it today, creating new mods, buying new DLCs, even producing radical content for this 7-year-old behemoth. So what's the aim of Cities Skylines? Strictly speaking, there isn't one. You plan the city as you want, progress at your own pace, build and develop as you like. You could reconstruct Manhattan. You could reconstruct London. You can imagine the city of your dreams. At the end of the day, it's about creation, creating something to sit back and admire. But the thing is, beyond the artistry of a pretty city, that building and developing defines the gameplay. It's impossible to play without growing. The game is structured around individual milestones, Little Hamlet, Metropolis, and so on, that you reach as your city grows. Playing by keeping the city in place is impossible. Even the little improvements you make to the city help increase building density, which increases population. And what is population good for? Well, the more people you have, the more tax revenue you collect. See, that's the other thing. Your city also has to make money. But I hear you say, you can turn off the limited money. Wow! True as that may be, you're still building in response to the supply and demand of the system. But I hear you say, you can turn off the demand as well. Wow! Yes, but you're still building by divvying your city up into residential, commercial, or industry. The three mutated backbones of basically every city simulator. But regardless of whether this is actually a good representation of urban geography, which it isn't, it puts players in the mindset of industrial production. Cities, in the eyes of these demands, are spaces of capital flows. Individuals live to produce and to consume. This brings us to Henri Lefebvre. One of Lefebvre's key ideas was the social production of space, and how this production is controlled by capitalism. Basically, Lefebvre was thinking about how, in the industrial city, the factories go in one location, the dwellings in another, and the remainder is shaped by the relationship between those two spatial forms. Beyond the use value, or lived experience of a city, its exchange value, the role each space plays in the market, becomes the most important thing. In his words, the crisis of the urban starts with the rise of competitive and industrial capitalism, and has never stopped getting deeper. The city contains a significant amount of past and fixed labour, which the capitalists use to capture living labour. What it contains thus survives the wear and tear of the instruments of labour. It maintains the division. So capitalism creates cities because the buildings required for consumption and production have a spatial footprint, and the location chosen for each of these buildings will be dictated by the prevailing economic conditions. As Lefebvre suggests, piles of objects and products in warehouses, mounds of fruit in the marketplace, crowds, pedestrians, goods of various kinds, juxtaposed, superimposed, accumulated. This is what makes the urban. Like everything else, the social production of space has escalated under late capitalism. Urban theorists talk about the financialization of the city, how space is increasingly cordoned off for glass towers and sky guns, reserved for use by operatives of financial capital.
Was all this legal? Absolutely f***ing not.
Now, quizzle me this. Would you choose to build a city like this of your own free choice? Segregated cityscapes for the super rich, food banks for the needy, and a complicit suburbia in between? The weird thing is, city building games seem to suggest that these skyscrapers are a good thing, that they're a symbol of a city's success. In Cities Skylines, skyscrapers are just attractive monuments or high-density habitats, as opposed to the worthy, ostentatious display of wealth and waste of money they are in the real world. Okay, weird confession time. I actually really like the Leadenhall building, otherwise known as the Cheese Grater. I think it's fit, but I'd much rather it was a civic centre or a giant f***off library, as opposed to some great financial fortress. But I hear you say, what's so wrong with financialization? Aren't sky guns and giant magnifying glass murder boxes pretty sick? Or even efficient? Well, let's go back to Lefebvre and look at capital's effect on the city more widely. Lefebvre moved from his discussions on the social production of space into discussions of rhythms, and noted how, in the industrial city, the rhythms of the human body are overwritten by the rhythms of capitalism. Clocks, punch cards, and above all, specialisation of labour, meant that monotony and top-down planning were valued over spontaneity and free choice. And this hasn't really changed since. We might work more flexible hours post-COVID, but more and more of our rhythms are tied to work. Our phones deliver 24/7 email notifications, work-flavoured social networks pervade our communications, and so-called smartwatches take our vital statistics. Free time is no longer divorced from work, it's overwhelmed by it. And the city reinforces all of this. The constant back and forth of metro trains, the clock towers and ticker tapes, the street lamps that keep capitalism going once the circadian rhythm runs out of steam. Meanwhile, the elites watch over the capitalist city they maintain, insulated in their ivory towers. And that's exactly how things look in Cities Skylines too. There are no communal allotments here, no anarchist cooperatives. It's the baseline economic relationships that define these spaces. But I suppose you don't have to build your city like that. When I plan my cities, I try to build them with medieval centres, attempting to recreate how these cities might have looked at some point in an imagined past that obviously isn't real in the context of a city builder that's set in a perpetual present. It brings to mind the town of Poundbury, an architectural appeal to history built entirely by Prince Charles during the late 20th century. So my city ends up being like a virtual pretend Poundbury, totally absent of any authenticity, worse even than a huge grid, because in escaping the grid system, the city is pretending to be something it's not, to not be about efficiency and capital. Sure, a pretty city can play a role in other ways not accounted for in Skylines, for example the effect a well-planned street has on tourism or land value, but those things are just further nuances of the capitalist system. But come on, let's be honest with ourselves. The citizens in Cities Skylines don't actually seem to be bothered by how the city's laid out. They wouldn't even care if it was a huge grid. These citizens live in accordance with habits of flows, production and consumption, supply and demand, of everything, from industrial capital to commodities of leisure. Ultimately, these folks live at the mercy of two things: the weird face in the corner that tells you whether they have basic amenities, and this cell which tells you whether your city has enough income for them to persist. So here's an idea. The citizens of Cities Skylines aren't really citizens at all. They have no voting rights, They have no say in how their city is run beyond some basic platitudes and even more basic move with your feet kind of stuff. And spiciest of all, they're run by code. They only see the city as a series of nodes, points, instead of the painted reality the game layers on top. So on that basis, I don't think they can experience the city as a place. But what is place, you might ask? Well, that's a big theoretical question. But the upshot after 80 years of research is places are profound centres of human existence, defined by unself-conscious intentionality. Places create an effective bond with the people that travel through them. They invite an active and practical human involvement, and they're made from particular constellations of social relations. When you go pub, muck in with the social relations of the Hackney hipsters, you are creating place. I suppose what I'm implying here is that some lines of code that can only engage with the city instrumentally and can never establish such a bond with some wankers in East London can't possibly aspire to place. And this is where the concept of place comes together with the gameplay problem I highlighted earlier. Cities Skylines can only, at the end of the day, be about growth because it cannot be about living in the city. This is true of almost all simulator games. Regardless of their limiting factors or win conditions, they're all realistically about growth and management more than they are about the activities themselves, because it's almost impossible to make these virtual experiences embodied. Rollercoaster Tycoon was about creating an exciting park, but also about selling tickets. Planet Zoo was about building a beautiful sanctuary, but also about selling tickets. Euro Truck Simulator was about the thrill of the ride, but also about selling a big-ass pile of wood. These games are all limited by needing to aspire to a certain realism. Capitalist realism. A sense of reference to the capitalist mode that, if we're honest, forms the core of the experience. If the challenge of balancing creative vision with budget is taken away, all that remains is spectacle. But that spectacle is so thin. These games leave little scope to share creations in an embodied way with others, precisely because the creation is the valuable element of these experiences, not the everyday life beyond it. You can't really experience Planet Zoo as a zoo. You can't really experience the G's of Rollercoaster Tycoon's roller coasters. And you can't really experience the feeling of slapping a cheap porno against your driver's seat, lank with sweat after 17 hours on the road in Euro Truck Simulator 2. Of course, the difference with Euro Truck is you're playing the trucker. You're literally in the driver's seat, as opposed to the sort of top-down god view you enjoy in city builders and tycoon simulators. But still, your relationship is far from material. Your ongoing physical existence isn't tied up with your efficacy as a farmer, internet cafe proprietor, or indeed drug dealer, even if you're the one banging out the ganja personally. Moreover, if you die, you can just start over. This is exactly why there's so much scope to mess about in these simulator games. At the end of the day, we're not the ones on the hook. We're not part of that constellation of relations. We're on the outside, farting in. So in Cities Skylines, you build a neoliberal utopia of people who can't relate, can't revolt, and can't imagine any different. Cities Skylines and all these simulator games encourage us to accept the world as it really is, precisely because our relationship to their virtual equivalents remains so ephemeral. Why would you care about how zoning, planning, or financialization affect the lived experience in Cities Skylines if the city persists exactly the same regardless? An in-game city can be mind-bogglingly beautiful, even if it relies on systems that cripple livelihoods and concentrate wealth. Then again, so does a real-life city. But that's a story for another video.